Justin, so nice to have you here at the Big Ideas Summit, Chicago today.
Lovely to be here.
I've got a couple of questions for you
Of course.
regarding your presentation. So you talk about the importance of companies considering risk in real time.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by this and the importance of doing so?
Well, the world is, I view it as a system of systems, and it's increasingly complex. I think technology's made it more complex. The tempo of things has increased dramatically, and the relationship between forces in the world is more and more complex. So I think it's very important for companies to kind of think about risk in a wider sense, and they have done before. And as part of that, I think it's challenging yourself to look at risks that you may not be thinking of. And these things are emerging all the time. So rather than focus, I think most organizations can focus on 10 or so things they really care about, and everyone in the organization would know and talk about. I think it's challenging yourself all the time against a kind of matrix of things that could happen. So for example, having a consistent way of looking at the world, tracking risk factors across the whole planet, and then being able to measure yourself against, say, a threat in Cambodia versus a threat in China versus a threat in Mexico, under the same criteria, and say, will this impact us? Rather than starting with that sheet of paper and saying, we care about cyber, we care about the South China Sea, but then you never ask yourself the difficult questions, and they're the ones that come and get you. So I think emerging threats being tracked all the time is kind of one of the key things we want people to focus on.
Oh, that's great. So here today, how can the procurement pros in the room become better intelligence gatherers, and how should they use the information they are gathering?
Becoming good at intelligence is actually quite easy. It is really about having an effective process to take information that exists all around us and turn that into something you can use. So actionable insight is perhaps something I would use as a keyword for that. So once upon a time, information was hard to come by. You had to struggle to get it. Newspapers might take weeks across the Atlantic, and be out of date by the time they got there. Of course, nowadays we're swamped by information, and that's a change we've had in the last maybe 20 years. It's got to the extent it has, and certainly in the last 10 or so years with the advent of social media, to the point that mainstream media is now almost a bad term and not trusted, and people trust emotion and that kind of intimation of news much more. So I think with that kind of changing, it's much more about sifting the information you're getting and making something of it. The chances are in most situations, everything you needed to know was probably there, but you just couldn't pull it together. So having an effective process is what takes the information that we're imbibing all the time and turns that into something you can do something with. And ultimately, it needs to support a decision. And the key to doing this is no longer sort of finding the information, it's understanding what you need to know about your world. And that's kind of the big thrust of what I want to be talking about today.
Well, I think that's going to be a very interesting presentation. So what are some of the disruptive forces heading our way in 2018?
God, there are so many. Obviously, again, I come back to the fact the world is a complex system. And I think what we're seeing is that real breakdown of the post-Cold War order that meant that we did have a relative stability because there was always a balancing act going on between states that wouldn't allow things to get out of hand. And I think now that we've lost that, we're in this much more multipolar world. States are realizing that institutions are failing. The recent UN meeting, a lot of allegations that international organizations are failing to keep the peace, they're failing to keep balance. And of course, forces like Brexit, the changes in the states and things like that show these sort of rising tide of trends that we'll see, not just in 2018, but beyond. But certainly, geopolitics is back. Korea is something, obviously everyone's very worried about. And that's something I think we'll be talking about a lot today. And again, those are the obvious ones, but it's those emerging lower consequences. It's the effect of enduring migration from parts of the world where there is population pressure, there aren't the jobs. The effect of artificial intelligence, gradually, effectively being the new industrial revolution. I think paling the information revolution we've seen so far in terms of the effect on people's lives and traditional jobs changing. So again, that's much more beyond 2018, but we're seeing the tendrils of all of this now, and even things such as climate change, and obviously recent weather events, and again, they can be written off or not, but there is a pattern, an underlying pattern of events. So I think we'll see a lot more disruption in 2018. I've been pessimistic for the last few years, which I sometimes feel bad about, but I don't, because it's always been borne out. There are a lot of pressures in the world, but there are opportunities as well. So I think it comes down to valuing risk effectively as we go into 2018. You can't ignore these fantastic markets, you can't ignore these fantastic opportunities, but you need to know what you're doing to get there. And again, procurement is just ideally placed to see the organisation and allow it to be agile, but also make sure it has a resilience that I think we've got used to coping without. So once upon a time, there was redundancy in supply chain, there was depth in supply chain. That's expensive, so that's been kind of engineered out. And the problem with efficient stuff is it's very prone to disruption. So I think procurement has a really vital role to play in bringing all that together in the future.